Right now, you are probably wearing it. You slept under it last night. It touched your skin before you were old enough to have a memory. Of all the materials humanity has ever wrapped itself in, one has outlasted empires, caused wars, financed revolutions, and enslaved millions. And you have almost certainly never thought about it as anything more than the tag on your shirt that says 60% cotton. That tag is the end of a story 5,000 years long. What happened in the middle of it is not comfortable. Cotton is a shrub. In the wild, it grows in dry tropical regions, produces a flower that lasts one day, and then forms a bowl the size of a walnut filled with seeds wrapped in fiber. The fiber exists for one biological reason: to carry the seeds on the wind. The plant does not know it is clothing anyone. It does not know it built cities, financed navies, or that its cultivation required the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of human beings across 3 continents. It is just trying to scatter its seeds. Humans noticed the fiber and decided to use it for other purposes, and from that decision came 4 millennia of consequences that reshaped the entire world economy at least 3 separate times. The earliest confirmed cotton textile fragment comes from Mehrgarh in present-day Pakistan, dated to roughly 6000 BCE. The Indus Valley civilization, centered at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, was weaving cotton into fabric by 3000 BCE at the latest. Archaeologists excavating these sites in the 1920s found spindle whorls, the small weighted discs used to spin fiber into thread, in quantities that indicate industrial-scale production. Cotton was not a household craft in the Indus Valley. It was organized production. Someone was managing the planting, the harvesting, the ginning of seeds from fiber, the spinning, and the weaving at a scale that supplied urban populations. The Greeks knew Indian cotton existed, but most of them had never touched it. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described trees in India that produced wool finer than sheep's wool and more beautiful. He was describing a cotton plant. His description is slightly wrong in almost every detail and completely accurate in its essential claim. Indian cotton textiles were so fine, so soft, and so unlike anything available in the Mediterranean world that a man who had never seen the plant could only explain them as coming from a tree that grew wool. Indian weavers in the Ganges plain had been refining their techniques across centuries to produce fabrics with thread counts that modern industrial machinery struggles to replicate. The finest Bengali muslin, called woven air by the Mughal court because it was so sheer, required cotton grown in one specific microclimate near the confluence of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. Harvested at one specific phase of the growing season, spun by women whose fingers had to remain perpetually soft by regular submersion in the river, and woven on handlooms in humidity levels that prevented the thread from breaking. A single yard of the finest grade required 233 miles of spun thread. A full sari woven to that standard could be folded into a matchbox. Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb reportedly berated his daughter for appearing in public indecently dressed. She was wearing 6 layers of it. This was not a curiosity or a luxury. Indian cotton textiles were the dominant traded fabric across the Indian Ocean world for roughly 2,000 years. When archaeologists excavated Fustat in Egypt, the medieval predecessor city to Cairo, they found thousands of cotton textile fragments, Indian cotton, identifiable by the dyes and weave structures, sitting in the trash deposits of a city 5,000 kilometers from where the fabric was made. Indian merchants had built a commercial network connecting Gujarat and Malabar to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and East Africa that was moving cotton textiles in bulk before the Roman Empire existed. The network ran on credit instruments, on family relationships extended across generations and continents, and on an intimate knowledge of monsoon winds that functioned as a natural shipping schedule. Sail west with the summer monsoon, return east with the winter monsoon. Arab merchants entered this network gradually, and then completely. By the 9th and 10th centuries CE, Arab trading houses controlled significant portions of the Indian Ocean cotton trade, carrying Indian fabrics west and returning with gold, silver, and raw materials. Marco Polo traveled through the Indian cotton-producing regions in the 1290s and described the trade in terms that made clear European merchants had no equivalent to offer. What India produced in cotton, Europe could not produce in anything. The trade balance ran one direction. The Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean in 1498 was not, from the perspective of cotton, a revolution. Vasco da Gama reached Calicut on the Malabar coast and found a fully functioning commercial world that had been operating efficiently without European participation for 2 millennia. What the Portuguese brought was not a better commercial system. They brought cannons and the willingness to use them on merchant vessels that refused to purchase Portuguese transit licenses. The Estado de India, the Portuguese seaborne empire, was not a trading enterprise in the ordinary sense. It was a protection racket imposed on an existing trading network at gunpoint. The cotton kept moving. The Portuguese took a cut. The Dutch and English East India Companies, founded in 1602 and 1600 respectively, operated on a more sophisticated version of the same logic. They understood something the Portuguese had not fully grasped. The most valuable thing about the Indian cotton trade was not carrying Indian textiles to Europe, where they were luxury imports, but carrying Indian textiles within Asia, where they were everyday currency. Indian cotton cloth purchased pepper in Java. It purchased cloves in the Moluccas. It purchased Chinese silk in Guangzhou. The English East India Company in its early decades was less interested in selling Indian cotton to English consumers than in using Indian cotton as the medium of exchange that unlocked every other commodity in the Asian trade network. Cotton was money that grew on a shrub. This began to change as Indian textiles reached European consumers in larger quantities in the late 17th century. Calico, a plain cotton weave from Calicut, and chintz, a printed cotton fabric, became fashionable in England and France. They were lighter than wool, washable in ways that wool was not, cheaper than silk, and decorated with printed patterns in fast colors that European textile makers could not produce. English wool and silk weavers petitioned Parliament in terms of genuine economic panic. Indian fabrics were destroying their trades. In 1690 and again in 1720, Parliament passed Calico Acts prohibiting the wearing of printed Indian cotton in England. The acts were partly effective and entirely revealing. They show that Indian cotton had penetrated European markets so thoroughly in roughly 40 years that the domestic textile industry felt existentially threatened. The English solution to Indian textile competition was not to accept it. It was to steal the technique and industrialize it. The technical history of the English textile revolution runs through a series of machines whose inventors are commemorated on plaques in Lancashire and Derbyshire, while the broader context of what those machines were actually built to do gets softened in the telling. James Hargreaves patented the spinning jenny in 1770. Richard Arkwright patented the water frame in 1769. Samuel Crompton developed the spinning mule in 1779. Edmund Cartwright built a power loom in 1785. Each of these machines solved a specific bottleneck in cotton textile production. Together, across roughly 30 years, they transformed cotton spinning and weaving from skilled hand labor into mechanized industrial production. By 1800, English mills were producing cotton textiles faster than Indian hand weavers could respond to, at prices that undercut Indian cloth in markets where Indian traders had operated for 2,000 years. The effect on Indian textile production was catastrophic and deliberate. The English East India Company, and then the British Crown after 1858, structured Indian economic policy to prevent Indian industrialization while forcing Indian markets open to British cotton imports. Indian weavers who had supplied a global market found their market taken first, then found themselves growing raw cotton for English mills, rather than weaving it into finished cloth. The Indian cotton textile industry, the most sophisticated in the world for 2 millennia, was reduced to a supplier of raw material for the industry that had displaced it. The value was extracted at the mill, not the farm. The raw material question, though, took the cotton story somewhere darker still. English mills needed cotton fiber in quantities that India and Egypt alone could not reliably supply. The American South had geography, climate, and soil conditions ideal for cotton cultivation. It also had something that made large-scale cotton cultivation economically viable in the early 19th century: a system of forced labor that could be expanded to meet any level of demand the market created. Enslaved people had been cultivating tobacco and rice in the American colonies since the 17th century. Cotton cultivation in the American South was initially limited by the difficulty of separating the short staple cotton fiber from its seeds, a process called ginning that required enormous amounts of hand labor. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, patented in 1794, mechanized seed separation. One machine operated by one person could gin 50 pounds of cotton per day, replacing approximately 50 days of hand labor. The effect was immediate, and the direction was precisely the opposite of what mechanization usually implies. Because ginning was now fast and cheap, planting cotton became massively more profitable. Because cotton was massively more profitable, planters expanded cultivation as fast as possible. Because expansion required labor to plant and pick cotton, which the gin did not mechanize, demand for enslaved labor increased sharply. The United States banned the international slave trade in 1808, which pushed up the price of enslaved people and created a massive internal slave trade that moved hundreds of thousands of people from the Upper South to Alabama, Mississippi, and eventually Texas. Between 1790 and 1860, the enslaved population of the United States grew from 700,000 to nearly 4 million. Over the same period, American cotton production grew from approximately 3,000 bales per year to 4.8 million bales. These two numbers are not coincidental. One is the instrument of the other. American cotton dominated global markets by the 1840s. The American South was producing roughly 80% of the cotton imported by British mills, and British mills were producing roughly half the cotton textiles sold on world markets. The entire edifice of the British industrial economy, and through it, much of the broader industrialization of Western Europe, rested on a foundation of enslaved labor in Mississippi and Alabama. Southern planters and their political representatives understood this dependency and drew conclusions from it that turned out to be wrong. The theory called King Cotton, articulated most directly by South Carolina Senator James Hammond in a Senate speech in 1858, held that British economic dependence on American cotton made British intervention on the side of the Union in any civil conflict impossible. Britain needed the cotton. Cotton needed slavery. Therefore, slavery was protected by economic necessity. Hammond told the Senate that no power on earth dared make war on cotton. The Confederate government in 1861 acted on this theory. It initially restricted cotton exports to Britain and France, expecting economic pressure to force diplomatic recognition. The strategy failed. British mill owners did suffer. The Lancashire cotton famine of 1862 to 1865 threw 500,000 workers out of employment when American cotton stopped arriving. But Britain had accumulated cotton reserves before the war, and during the war it rapidly expanded cotton cultivation in Egypt and India. The Confederacy had miscalculated the speed with which British capital could redirect agricultural production. King Cotton did not deliver its promised kingdom. The Union won. Slavery was abolished. The cotton economy of the American South did not end. It reorganized around sharecropping, a system that bound formerly enslaved people and poor white farmers to the land through debt and contractual arrangements that reproduced many of the economic constraints of slavery without the legal designation. Sharecroppers grew cotton on land they did not own, borrowed money at interest from landowners or merchants to buy supplies, settled accounts at harvest in cotton, and ended most years in debt that carried forward to the next season. The legal freedom granted in 1865 operated inside an economic structure designed to prevent it from meaning very much. Cotton was still being harvested in the Mississippi Delta by black sharecroppers through the 1930s under conditions that federal investigators repeatedly documented as bearing closer resemblance to peonage than to free labor. The Great Migration, the movement of approximately 6 million black Americans from the South to northern cities between 1910 and 1970, was driven by multiple factors. One of them was the mechanization of cotton harvesting. The mechanical cotton picker, developed commercially by International Harvester and introduced widely in the 1940s and 1950s, replaced handpicking at a rate that eliminated the marginal economic value of sharecropper labor almost overnight. Planters who had resisted mechanization while labor was cheap and politically controllable adopted it rapidly when labor costs rose and the political climate shifted. The machine did not liberate anyone. It simply made the system of controlling people for cotton labor unnecessary in the way that the cotton gin had made it more necessary 150 years earlier. Technology did not drive this history in any clean direction. People made choices. The machines served the choices. By 1960, cotton's position in the global fiber market was under pressure from a different direction entirely: synthetic fibers. Nylon, developed by DuPont in the 1930s, and polyester, commercialized in the 1950s, were cheaper to produce than cotton, required no agricultural land, and could be engineered to specific performance characteristics. The share of global fiber production represented by cotton fell from roughly 80% in 1950 to around 35% by 2020. Cotton survived in markets where its natural properties, breathability, absorbency, the specific hand feel of well-made cotton fabric, remained valuable enough to justify the cost differential. Global cotton production today runs to approximately 25 million metric tons per year. The leading producers are China, India, the United States, Brazil, and Pakistan. The supply chain connecting a cotton field in Xinjiang or Gujarat to a finished garment in a European or American retail store now passes through multiple countries, multiple hands, and multiple layers of subcontracting that make tracing the origin of any specific fiber in any specific garment nearly impossible. This opacity is not an accident. It is a feature. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, signed in the United States in December 2021, created a legal presumption that cotton produced in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, which produces roughly 85% of China's cotton and around 20% of the world's cotton supply, is the product of forced labor and therefore banned from import into the United States unless companies can prove otherwise. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute estimated in 2020 that more than 80 major global brands had supply chains that potentially touched Xinjiang cotton. Most of them said they were investigating. Investigations in supply chains of that complexity, with that many layers of subcontracting and that little transparency, tend to produce results that confirm what the company wanted to find. The cotton in the shirt you are wearing right now has a history. That history almost certainly includes someone whose labor was not fully voluntary, in a country you may never visit, in conditions you are not meant to think about when you reach for your wallet. The fiber is the same fiber it has always been. The relationship between the people who grow it and the people who wear it has not changed as much as the tag on the shirt implies.